Hello and welcome to the Posture Dojo podcast. My name is Sam Miller, and I'm here to bring you on a journey of posture transformation. Having a diagnosis of kyphoscoliosis of 85 degrees as a teenager sent me on a journey through many different methodologies. Bracing and surgery wasn't an option, so I've explored a lot of alternative therapies about restoring and building our highest posture. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Andromeda Stevens, who has all of the skills that are very important and very necessary when you're going to consider taking on the very important and big task of rebuilding your posture. Andromeda, it seems that you have experience with the Schroth method, the rotational angular breathing that we can learn to derotate the rotation that happens in scoliosis. You have chiropractic work to eliminate interference from the electrical signals that are passing from our brain to our spinal cord and nervous system. You have Pilates to develop the musculoskeletal core. Is there things that I'm missing? Please introduce yourself and your background.
Good morning. Yes, thank you so much for having me. I know you covered it. That's pretty much everything in my toolbox right there. I became a chiropractor I graduated in 1996. I went to chiropractic school because I also had a curvature as a child, right? I had scoliosis as a child that was largely just undiagnosed and untreated. I'm sorry. And I managed that over years and years through chiropractic for myself. And that was really the only treatment that I had available to me. And it did work for me. It kept me out of pain for years. So I was so impressed with the chiropractor that I worked with that I decided to become a chiropractor because it was such a life altering experience for me. So I became a chiropractor and practiced for many years and wasn't really taught anything about scoliosis in school, which still blows my mind. And I really only bumped into the Schroth method many years later because we had a client at the Pilates studio with a very large curvature who was being told she needed surgery. She didn't want to do that for all the obvious reasons. So she asked me what other options there were. I said, I don't know, but I will research it. And I found the Schroth method for her. I sent her to go do that. And she came back with a booklet from the clinic. And I looked at that and I said, I have to know what this is. And so I investigated what that is and went down that rabbit hole as well.
I went through the medical system in, I guess, it was the early 2000s, and it's a very physical focused system. It's looking at, okay, you've got a curve. We can either brace this or we can take out this vertebrae and fuse these vertebrae and straighten it up very physically. It's very physically focused. What does it actually take to address a scoliosis or a kyphosis?
Well, it depends a lot on the particular case, the age of the client, and even within the age of the client, how flexible their spine is. If the spine is very flexible, it will respond to treatment, whether it's exercise or postural reeducation or bracing. So the flexibility matters, the age matters if the client is still rapidly growing or is an advanced age and is having more of a degeneration situation going on and or a disease process going on. So it does require like a multifaceted approach that would include, in my opinion, a good brace, if that's a possibility, a good exercise program, which they are now just calling scoliosis specific postural reeducation. And there are many schools of that within the Schroth family, I guess you would call it, as well as just postural reeducation, which could be through activities of daily living. How can you manage your curve all day long, not just doing your exercises and doing your bracing, but how could you sit better? How could you stand better? How could you move through the world better and have just better overall habits that serve you all day long? Because you could do no, you can do an exercise program if it was an hour a day, which would be amazing. That would be overpowered if you were having bad habits all day, right? So if you have good habits instilled that you're sitting properly all day, like you'll notice I'm leaning to the left. My scoliosis goes to the right, and I spent all of my teen years and all of college leaning onto my scoliosis because it just was more comfortable. It was a habit for me, so I was exacerbating that. So I've just learned in my daily life how to make small tweaks that have made an enormous difference. So it's all encompassing. You can't really come at it from one angle.
And if the exacerbation can happen if you're not aware of how you're breathing. So when we have these scoliosis and kyphosis, we have this compromise of our structure. Sometimes we get a splaying of the rib cage where we've got one side that's expanding more, and our breath is naturally taking that path of least resistance. Our body is then going the path of least resistance, and it starts working different. Instead of activating the glutes, we're tightening our lower back and our core. To we get all these types of compensations and imbalances. And I guess I'd like to focus this conversation towards those people who are undiagnosed. I think that's the majority of the listeners. It was certainly my case. Or undiagnosed is in undiagnosed, diagnosed as idiopathic, which is that the undiagnosed diagnosis. Do you People who have this curve, people who are living with curves, but they're looking to reduce pain, mitigate the long term effects, and get some correction as well? So I guess I'll start with a question that I get a lot on social media is, can I fix it? And at what age does it become? It's often managing those expectations. But how do you respond to that when people say, hey, maybe they're 20, 25 years old and they're like, hey, can I fix this scoliosis?
It is a big question. I bump into that almost daily as well. And I would take you back to the same conversation that it really is independent of every individual, whether they are of a certain age or a certain magnitude of curve or the location of the curve, the stiffness of the curve, their compliance. There are a myriad of issues that will affect whether this can be helped or not. But in general, can you fix it? Had patients that got great results that were at a significant curvature and are down to within 10 degrees of a Cobb angle or 5 degrees of rotation or 0 degrees of rotation. And these are youngsters. And that's considered an amazing result. For adults, they're typically told once you're done growing or you've gotten your period as a young woman, you're done. You can't fix anything. The brace won't help you. Take the brace off. Don't try anything anymore, which isn't true. People can stay flexible and compliant and growing for a couple of years after that happens. And for boys, it's even longer. Boys can grow all the way into college. Taking your foot off the gas too soon is a mistake. But I do have adults of all ages that I have seen their rotation improve significantly, not just clinically with a scoliometer, but visibly. I always feel like there's room for improvement. I don't let people get hung up on the numbers that they're going to fix the curve. If they're uncomfortable, the most important thing for me is to get them more comfortable just in their life. And then the numbers don't seem to matter. For me, I was in pain every single day, all day. So the fact that I'm not in pain every day is good enough for me. I feel like I'm not going to progress the curve. I'm not in pain. I don't mind how it looks or what the number is anymore. So for me, the goals would be number one, get out of pain and get more comfortable. And number two, stop any progression that might be happening. And number three, if we can get an improvement, then we will go for that and we will call that a huge success. So that's the tiered approach of how to
Beautiful.
think about. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. A lot of teenagers are left disempowered by having said, no, bird bracing isn't going to work, surgery isn't going to work. Or sometimes surgery, okay, let's go with surgery. For me, I really think that the breath work still needs to be as important, even if you're doing the surgery. There are some studies showing that there's a lot of progression of curves even after the surgery. And I think that is that lack of that holistic approach to this to help people, even though they're okay, you're getting that spinal column straightened, you're still going to work on those breathing patterns, which are ultimately going to form your body still if we're
Okay.
breathing
We
higher up
haven't
in our,
breathing yet.
yeah. So
Certainly. Go ahead. So let's talk about a post surgical situation. So you've done a big change in the spinal column, like you said, and you've done some fusion or tethering or whatever procedure you've had, the muscles are still left wherever you left them. So if there's an imbalance of strong muscles and weakened muscles and rotation and compression of a breathing zone, those are still there after surgery. And you can still work on those things even after you've been fused because you still need to find that balance so you don't continue to put stress on the hardware and continue to possibly progress the curvature or, God forbid, break the hardware, right? There is a whole Schroth protocol that can be done even after surgery. And then since you mentioned Pilates, that it comes in very nicely because Pilates can be very supportive way to exercise. You're on a reformer where it can support your spine. You can work towards rebalancing and posture and core without necessarily being up in gravity, at least until you're ready to do so and bearing load, right?
So let's speak to this person who's their past braces and surgery. They've realized they've come across some piece of content. They've said, "Wow, I might actually be able to do something about my situation." There's so many different paths to go down, from the breath work to the anatomy to your mobility, your exercises, your strength. There's so many different things to learn to really start effectively becoming the builder of your own posture, your own sculpture. From the diagnosis, what do you suggest? And what skills do you think are important for someone like that to pick up? So, how scoliometer, x ray, and then learn Schroth breathing and maybe some type of mobility? Where would you summarize that path that you would recommend for a person in that position?
So I always start with their activities of daily living. So we have the habits and postures cleaned up throughout the day so that they're sitting properly at work or at school, because that's hours. And then possibly some way to modify how they sleep, because that's another number of hours. And then they can dovetail that into their activity. So if they're learning how to shift away from a curve or load specifically away from a curve, that they can do that while they're exercising. So I start with that because it's really important to me that they have that skill. And then I go immediately to the breathing. That's the very next thing. So learning how to breathe away from the convexity. If there's a curve, and you could look at any x-ray, you would see on a curve that you have a compressed area. Sometimes you can literally see the ribs are closer together on the compressed area and more open on the convexity. And like you said, it's just, I forget how you put it, but it's like
The
a
path
path
of
of least.
least resistance.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. So your habit would be to lean towards your curve and perhaps breathe towards your curve. So learning how to do the opposite of that is sometimes remarkably easy to learn. It sounds so strange to, how am I supposed to breathe on one side? But it can be taught with a skilled practitioner. It's not that hard. And even if it is hard, with practice, it always comes, it always starts to happen. And it's going to be different with somebody with a scoliosis versus somebody with a kyphosis. The breathing will be different. If it's a scoliosis that's like a high curve and we're talking about ribs and actual lung space, it tends to be the easiest because you can really, oh, I have a lung there. It makes sense for me to breathe into where I normally breathe, but on the other side. If it's a lower curve, it's a little stranger because you don't literally have a lung there, but you can still expand any area that you put your attention to. So it'll change, the breathing will change whether the curve is located high or low, or even if you have two curves. And then if it's a kyphosis, it would really matter on how the rib cage is shaped. People tend to think, oh, okay, kyphosis, if I'm looking down the center of somebody like an aerial
yeah,
view, you would think, okay, so the kyphosis is really large in the back and then maybe large in the front. So I should just breathe in the front. But in fact, sometimes it's more a matter of breathing to the sides to change that egg shape from front to back to more of an oval side to side. So sometimes for kyphosis, the breathing should be lateral breathing and not just breathe away from the curve like we do skull and just breathe to the front. It could be, it would really depend on the actual structure of that person's curvature. But
sure.
breathing away from a curve is, I think about it like an internal way to mold your curve and your rib cage by yourself. You're not using a brace, it's not an exercise. It's you internally reshaping, because it's a three-dimensional pliable rib cage that can be molded. And every time you breathe, you're creating like volume on one side, strength and activity is happening on one side. But when you breathe in one area, it also causes a derotation. It's like when you look at those weather patterns where they show like a hurricane that's going around in a circle. I think about the breathing, like visualize that. It's rotating the breath into a concave area to do a dynamic derotation of the rib cage, not just a spot. So it's fascinating.
It is. It is. The system is in flux, and we're every breath is this renegotiation with gravity, right? We stop breathing, we give up to gravity. So we do have this chance to breathe in different ways. In something that held me back for many years was just not being aware of it, not being aware that I could breathe differently. I just breathe how I breathe. So this first, like, a really important step for me in there is like having this awareness of what's possible, and then also kind of learning that you can create these neuromuscular pathways that are really fascinating to me right now. Because earlier in my journey, I'm like, okay, it's stretching. I'm doing gymnastic rings, which are amazing for anyone with postural deficiencies. Is gymnastic rings, you're building up your wrist and your shoulder strength, and that allows you to hang and go into traction and do different types of planks and a lot of different methods there. But my approach over the years has gone from physical is still extremely important, but to make the most of those physical activities that I do, from the rings to the planks to all these different bodyweight stuff, to go deeper with those exercises, I'm going into the nervous system, understanding how the fascia can have us locked in certain holding patterns, releasing the tensions that are getting in the way of being in our full expansion and contraction when we're breathing. Obviously, sucking the belly and not wanting to show your belly can have an effect, or just even the lower back bracing naturally the imbalances higher up and causing disengaging the glutes. And so you get all these types of stuff that gets in the way and that gets locked in the fascia. The nervous system is a key piece that I'd like to kind of dive in a little bit more with you, because I know is could you explain how you perceive the nervous system in your processes with this type of postural correction?
The nervous system can get locked into this, excuse me, this pattern. And you may or may not have had this curve pattern for quite a while. And so the nervous system is very used to that. It's used to defaulting to that. It's used to breathing the path of least resistance. It's used to that muscle tension being that way. And sometimes when you start to change that and start to influence a correction, there can be a temporary disruption of the nervous system. So some people will initially, they can get sore, obviously, because you're rearranging muscular imbalance and you're going to get sore where the muscles are now going to be start to get activated. But it also can cause people to be initially nauseous and have a visceral reaction, like a seasick feeling or an emotional reaction. Some people get like this weird cold sweat thing that happens. So the nervous system can very much react to being placed in a new way, a new posture, a new reality. And then it tends to work itself out. And then the innate intelligence of your nervous system, of your brain, of your entire body wants to recalibrate. It wants to be back in a place of stasis, of natural, relaxed ability to function, and digestion will become easier. I've had people have report all sorts of things happen, like incontinence issues, pelvic floor issues have been resolved just by postural education and the breathing technique. So the nervous system is definitely part of the process. And it's always interesting to see how somebody is going to react to that. For me, the breathing also connects to that. And for me personally, the breathing brought my pain down from like a 7 to a 2 or a 3. almost instantly if I'm having pain in my scoliosis and I remember where to redistribute my breathing, my pain immediately drops down. And other people have told me the same thing. So that's how powerful that breathing can be. I don't know if that answered your question though.
Yeah, we're here to explore, and I have not been formally trained as a chiropractor, and I am now in a position where a lot of people are coming to me for help. So I'm really just rounding out my kind of information and learning as much as I can, because there's a lot of people who were neglected in certain ways, and they need to go on this postural re-education path, right? So postural re-education, and in the Schroth breathing, when you inhale and you expand to the side of the concavity and you inhale back and you derotate on your inhales, as you exhale, you tense and hold that new position. You hold that new educated position. And this breath is fascinating to me. I'm That's where I'm currently at, evolving how I can you develop this breath to re-educate from, yes, the physical but also the emotional sense, because, and this is where the nervous system is a key piece to this, because as we've corrected, right, we've corrected with our inhale and we're exhaling, the emotional state that we're in as we're exhaling is that re-education process. And so it's feeling safe, it's feeling strong, it's removing any of the protection tension that we have, and we're replacing it with this strength and comfort and confidence and safety type feeling. And I think that's really important. Have you Am I onto something?
I feel like once you have any kind of tool in your toolbox, you feel more empowered and you feel like you have more control over what's happening. If you've been undiagnosed or just diagnosed and not helped in any way and told repeatedly, there's nothing that you can do. It's too bad, so sad. There's no fixing it. That's really depleting. So to learn that you do have the power to make some changes and to feel better and take a little bit more control, that's a big deal. It doesn't matter what age you are. In terms of the breathing, I've seen a lot of my patients that have done Schroth. There are so many schools of Schroth that have done Schroth elsewhere, and they were either not taught the breathing at all, which I don't know, I don't get that because it's really all about breathing. Or they were taught this inhale only, but not the exhale that you're talking about. And the exhale is really where the meat and potatoes happen because that's when you are bracing and strengthening and stabilizing something. So an inhale is great. You're going to expand away from the curve. You're going to create space and volume and some strength, and it's fantastic. But the minute you exhale, you're going to lose that. So to think about the inhale, and I usually teach this using like a blood pressure cuff so you can see what is happening, that you think about the inhale like whatever it is for you, if it's a balloon or a bubble or whatever it is, that you think about that volume happening on the inhale. And then on the exhale, that you're actually exhaling, obviously, but it feels more like a back pressure of an exhale. So the exhale should feel like more volume. So if we imagine that, I don't know why those emojis happen. Inhale to expand, and then exhale to expand more. So you're bracing and contracting your muscles, your core and your correction, but you're pushing more into the concavity on the exhale. You're not letting it collapse back down.
Yeah.
So I think really important part of the breathing that you don't ignore, that the breathing is the exhale, sorry, is very powerful.
And
You don't have to be.
that exhale is really where you're building that your brace. You're building that musculoskeletal brace, right? And you're educating the neural, like these are the new pathways in your brain that as you're tensioning, you're creating these new pathways. Is that accurate?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. That's what causes that brace that you're talking about, but that's also when you can direct that area to strengthen. You're thinking about whatever the concavity is that you're lengthening or volumizing the area and then strengthening it where that is. So you're opening it, you're strengthening in a lengthened state. Yes.
Beautiful. And so a lot of, yeah, I guess the conventional medical system isn't as likely to recommend stuff like this because it requires the patient to do work, which means it's giving away the responsibility of the result, or it's not, they can't guarantee the results, or they can't for
Glad
whatever
you
reason. What's that?
it's becoming a big issue, not just with me, but with parents and patients and other practitioners and orthotists who are making these braces that the medical community, by and large, is poo-pooing what the options are for non-operative care for people. And there are so many options. Even if you just want to be more active and take up yoga or take up Pilates or go back to your sport or whatever it is, to discourage people from seeking any kind of care that's non-operative. It's not just poo-pooed, but it's sometimes actively discouraged by the medical community, and, like, surgeons, orthopedists are telling people, "You can do a brace, but it's not gonna do anything. You can do a brace, but it's only gonna stabilize it, it's not going to help it. You can do exercise, but there's no research on that." None of those things are true. There's an astounding amount of research that's happening if you reach out to the Scoliosis Research Society, SRS. They're doing research all the time on bracing techniques, which one is doing what kind of result versus another kind, and Schroth versus different types of scoliosis specific exercise and what the effects are. There's a lot of research. You just have to go find it. But somehow the doctors are most of them are not interested in the research or don't believe the research or aren't looking at I'm not sure what's happening, but it's really sad to see these parents and patients who have been told, "Don't bother." And so they feel like they're doing hocus pocus if they reach out to anybody to help them with their situation. They feel like they're throwing money possibly right out the window, that it's not gonna work, but I'm so desperate I'll try anything, rather than feeling like this is really something that I should be doing. This is really gonna help me, and to feel, like, secure in the path that they've taken. So I feel like it really disempowers people, and I wish it would change. I hope that it will over time.
I believe it is. I believe it is changing. I've noticed, especially with doctors and healers who have been through a type of condition like this themselves, they have more empathy and even more belief in these alternative methods because they've felt and experienced the results of doing it. And I think that is happening. At least there's people who are far more open to this kind of thing, harnessing the body's ability to correct and align itself. I'd like to, based on that, do you believe you know where your scoliosis originated from?
Huh, great question. I first noticed that I had pain when I was maybe 12, somewhere around 12. No idea what it was, wouldn't know what to compare it to. I guess I didn't complain enough for my parents to get activated to look. And then when they did the screening in junior high school, I guess they didn't catch it. So I didn't really catch it until I was in, but I did end up at a chiropractor, just happenstance. And she just happened to look at me. I was probably 14 or 15 at the time. And she said, "Oh, you have scoliosis." I said, "I do." "What is that? What does that mean? Am I broken? Is it fixable? Is it going to get worse? What does that mean?" That's a scary thing for a kid to hear. And I just started getting chiropractic care at that point, but we never did an x-ray at that moment. I didn't have an x-ray until I was in chiropractic college, I think. So I knew I had scoliosis, but I didn't really know what it looked like or where it was. I just knew that I was uncomfortable all the time.
Okay. And 80% of this is undiagnosed. Did you have any indication or
No,
what
just
did you?
discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah.
No. The screening that is happening now in schools has changed. It used to be a federal, I don't know if you would call it a mandate, but it was more nationwide that schools would do the screenings for children. And then they decided to leave it up to individual states. So a lot of states decided to stop doing the screening for whatever reason. So I think the undiagnosed population has increased because the screenings have stopped. So really it's going to be up to the pediatricians and the parents to really take notice, and coaches and any other kind of trainers to really take notice. And if you see something, get it checked out.
There's a hypothesis made by Dr. Roth in 1969. He proposed that asynchronous neuroosseous growth, which is like asynchronous growth of the neural brain and spinal cord with the vertebral bones. Then in Dr. Chu in 2009 or 2006, somewhere in there, they studied scoliosis, adolescent idiopathic scoliosis people who in that study they found that people with scoliosis had shorter spinal cords in proportion to their spinal column. And in my own process, as I've realized the consequences of that, I feel like there's a lot of truth to this, and I'm just putting it out there and conversing with this because I've seen the benefits of understanding that this might be the case for a lot of people. And to get that derotation, that correction, that elongation that we're looking for with our breathing, if our spinal cord, which is an extension of our brain, is constricted. Maybe there was a trauma, maybe there was a protection mechanism, maybe there's just chronic tension that we're just holding in brain and spinal cord. We're essentially kind of limiting the freedom and the elongation of the spinal cord. And I think there's a lot to it. And it makes so much sense because when you imagine a brain with a noodle spinal cord essentially hanging from it, and then you've got the vertebrae, which are sitting on top of it, if you tense that spinal cord and then you go through your teenage years where you're growing quite fast, if there's any type of chronic tension or contraction in the spinal cord, you're going to see that warping effect that you get from scoliosis and kyphosis. As soon as I understood that concept, I was like, wow, that makes so much sense. And I was going into my movements, my different mobility stuff. I started like really just going an extra layer deep of letting go because I'm all in this whole process over the past 6 years of really diving in. I've really found that there's no limit to how deeply we can let go in some of these movements to bring that relaxation, to allow that alignment to happen. And I've had so much benefit from it. And I feel like this study needs more attention because of this correlation between shorter spinal cords and this column, I think has a lot of weight to it.
Yeah, I think the research is really ramping up. Previously, we didn't have a lot of research that was happening. So in just the past few years, that has really taken off. And they still call it idiopathic in most cases because they don't know what caused it. They don't know if it's genetic. They do know it's familial, but they haven't really isolated that yet. They're still working on that. There could be, obviously, there are non idiopathic reasons. There could be a congenital defect of some kind, like one bone is formed slightly different than the other. All sorts of congenital things can cause scoliosis. But going back to the cord thing, in some cases, there is actually something called a tethered cord syndrome. And you would really need to have that diagnosed by an MRI. It can't be seen on an X-ray. It can sometimes show up clinically. If you do some tests, you can check for that. And it's fascinating. It's not super common. In terms of the research, in idiopathic, is the spinal cord shortening more of a factor? I don't know. I'd have to read that research, but there is a Schroth protocol for a tethered cord syndrome. So that's a legitimate, like the cord is tight, so it's causing that buckling and that rotation and then the curvature. There are exercises and processes to start to like loosen that up. It almost feels like you would be flossing that spinal cord inside the spinal column to create some freedom and reduce that tension. So there are some fascinating exercises that do help with that.
Okay, so I and that's really where I've been honing in on some nerve flossing. Would you recommend some, or what rabbit hole on the internet you would go down to find those?
You want to know if that's even the case for you. If you start doing exercises for your spine, anticipating it's a tethered cord situation, and you don't have, then the exercises could actually be counterproductive for the scoliosis if you don't have a tethered cord situation, because they do involve a lot of twisting and flexing and extending. So if you had a scoliosis without a tethered cord, you might not necessarily want to implement those exercises because you might have a hyperkyphosis or hyperlordosis or a lot of rotation in your spine already, and those remedies wouldn't be indicated for you. You need to have a proper diagnosis of what's going on with you before you start implementing remedies
And that's
because
through an MRI. Because
yeah, an
where does the
MRI.
tethering happen on the?
So the tethering can be it's complex. There is something called a Chiari malformation, or it's called a syrinx, which is it can either happen at the brain stem, just like right above the opening of the skull. It can happen inside of the skull or just below the skull. It could also happen along the spinal cord, but it really could happen anywhere. And you could have two syrinx, you could have three syrinx, you could have one syrinx. And so the only way to see that is with an MRI to find out where those are. And those are almost like little, it's almost like if you have seaweed and you have those little bulbs on the seaweed. It's almost like little, I'm not describing it very well, but like little blips that would happen in the spinal cord. And those get a little stuck in the column. So that would cause that tethering. And you can't see that on an x-ray. That's soft tissue.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I know. I've definitely been. I'd like to do that. I've gotten X-rays, but usually they're pieced together. I just because not only is it the actual X-ray or the MRI, it's the person who can help you walk through what all of this means as well. So that's why I think you've got quite a unique talent stack to be able to do this for people. Because otherwise, you're going to an orthopedic surgeon and they're looking at it this angle for surgery or not. Having a great diagnosis and a great conversation is so valuable that I think a lot of people miss out on.
Yeah. Let's talk about imaging for a second if you want to.
Yes,
So when people take x-rays, sometimes they will have them taken in these pieces and then you have to piece them together. Not ideal because when you piece anything together, it's not going to line up just right. And then it's going to be really hard to measure that. And it's going to be possible that you miss something because so I don't love when it's multiple images. If you can get a full spine x-ray all at one time, it will give you the best information. And it's not just the one view, right? We really need to see what's happening from the side view, which they call the sagittal plane. What's happening with your spine from front to back? How is the neck curve? How healthy is the kyphosis and those curves absolutely matter to scoliosis as well. So a side view is imperative. You're going to miss a lot of information if you don't get a side view. So, love a full spine x ray, love both views. The people are concerned about getting x rays, especially with a child, that you're doing repetitive x rays because you have to monitor, right, every few months. The EOS system of getting an x ray is far superior because it's such a low dose of radiation and it's a quick shot. Some of them are now three-dimensional, almost like a CAT scan or an MRI, where you can get a three-dimensional view of the spine in one full spine X-ray.
amazing.
They're
We're using
less, and they're harder to find, and it's a little expensive. You need to be usually in a bigger city or within a hospital, but it's worth investigating to find out about possibly getting EOS X-rays or low dose rather than the standard
so
X-rays.
we're looking for 3D EOS imaging. Is that what we're?
Yeah, that's really the cutting edge way to get imaging done.
And then MRI, when and how?
MRI is usually only suggested when the doctor is suspecting there's something else going on that's causing scoliosis, if it's not just considered idiopathic, if they're worried about a tethered cord, if they're worried about some other disease process or malformation that's happening that could be causing it, you want to rule that out. So an MRI is done when you have any suspicion that it's not a standard idiopathic scoliosis.
So I've seen there's a company using AI diagnosis with MRI. Is there a particular type of MRI that we want to go towards?
I don't think so. I believe all MRIs are about the same.
So then it comes to we have this great imaging, whether it's through this 3D EOS X ray or an MRI. Where do we have these conversations? Obviously, you offer your services. How do your services work? And is it always remote? Where does someone go to?
For the imaging?
for understanding the imaging, because I think a key piece in someone who's going to get serious, let's say that 20 something who's looking at, I'd like to actually become a sculptor of my own body. For me, especially when it comes to this breathing, understanding how my spine goes through my body is extremely helpful, because I
Yes.
have quite a severe cut. I've got like this, and I've got this, and then I got a little kyphosis. So I'm like, I got a lot of stuff going on. So the more I can visualize it in my mind, the more I can go in and, okay, yeah, I know this, I know what I'm doing. I can navigate my body now with the breath and sculpt that. So that the I'd like to get either the 3D or the MRI, but I'm wondering where do you recommend, where do people find someone they can talk to about this? Because okay, these images are great, but how do we find people to have these types of conversations?
The interpretation of it, yes. So when you had imaging done, typically a radiologist will do the findings of the images.
Which
It's not
is
necessarily
usually very technical, very anatomical, or
right.
columbar.
It's like it's a radiologist who hasn't seen you clinically, hasn't met you, doesn't know what your concerns are, doesn't really know what they haven't been guided to what am I looking for. They're just going to do a basic reading, and not all of them even measure the Cobb angles. They're going to look for fractures and disk space and alignment possibly, but they're not going to be looking with the same eyes as a clinician would look at. So the report doesn't always give you everything that you're asking for. Then you're going to have to talk, because the radiologist isn't going to talk to you. You're going to talk to the doctor about the findings. So the doctor that you've been working with to get the imaging done should do the interpretation with you and sit down with you, explain it to you, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes they're just like, "Oh yeah, it's a 20-degree scoliosis. Don't worry about it. Let's keep an eye on it and watch." And that's not good enough for you. If you take your results to a different practitioner, whether it's a chiropractor, a scoliosis professional of whatever ilk, because there are so many schools now that treat scoliosis, like we said, the scoliosis specific exercise modalities. Find somebody that is specializing in scoliosis, and that person will likely sit down and really go through and explain to you what is happening. You need to understand what the curve is, like where is the curve, how big is the curve, and then how much is it rotating. And that's never, not never, but usually not measured on a radiograph. You have to measure that clinically. You can measure a radiograph, but it's complicated. So you want to know that. And then you want to also measure the sagittal curves. Has somebody measured the kyphosis? Do you know what that number is? How does your body line up? Where is your head in relation to your pelvis? And how are you standing? Where are you bearing load? So you need somebody to really go through it with you. And that's going to be, unfortunately, up to each person to do their own research. You have to get on the Google and start searching for somebody in your area. And if there isn't somebody in your area, I do think it's worth traveling to somebody who can explain this to you and get you on a good path and a good program, because you might not have to see that person all of the time, and then perhaps you can start to work with that person virtually, but it's going to be worth you doing the legwork to find somebody and then go wherever they are.
And yeah, if you're in that traveling situation, you're going to get a great understanding of where you're at. You're going to get a path to go on. So these programs, how do you work with your programs?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
As
So how
in, yeah. So what, like in terms of it, the way you work, you'll provide a consultation and then a direction if they're traveling. But I guess for people who are in person, what does your in person program look like to really take this on?
I believe imaging is mandatory. We can't start working with somebody and diagnosing somebody and giving them influential exercises without imaging. So we have to get imaging done if it hasn't been done. If it's ancient imaging, I like to get newer imaging because things can change. Even in an adult, they can progress up to a degree a year, sometimes faster if they're in a degenerative process. So I like newer imaging. And then we sit down together and I do what I just described to you. We go over the images and we really understand them. We measure everything and look at the pictures, and then we look at the person standing. Like, what is your posture? How are you standing? I will measure them with the scoliometer to see where the rotations are, and we mark everything down. We're going to mark their height, whether they're standing or sitting, because that it changes sometimes whether you're measuring just the height of the spinal column or the entire person over time, of course. And then we will maybe take some pictures. So if we're looking at somebody's posture, and then we're going to start to play with some corrections of how we could get more balanced in your standing posture to get your spine more to the midline so that you're not bearing load on your curves. And then we take pictures before and after. And then we'll talk about how can we translate this into sitting. So all the activities of daily living, I go over all of those. And then we do sleeping and we take pictures of all of that. And I send them home with a booklet so that when they get home, they have a full explanation of all of their exercises, right? They're not going to go home and go, I don't know what we just did. I don't remember. That's not okay. They need specific take home material. And then if we have time, then we get into the breathing lesson. I go right into breathing because it's going to be the fastest, most powerful tool that we have. So we talk about breathing. And if we dive a little further, then we start talking about the hanging that you were mentioning and how traction can be amazing if it's not contraindicated for you. Don't want to do that if you have a fusion, especially if it's a new fusion, possibly if it's an older fusion. We talk about being able to do traction. Is it appropriate for you? Is it inappropriate for you? Do you have, like you talked about using the rings? Not all of us can do that because we don't have the grip strength or we have shoulder issues. So if we can't hang, what other options do we have to create some nice traction on the spinal column? And there are other ways to do that. So we talk about that. And then that's usually it for the first visit. And then I let them get used to that process of sitting and standing and sleeping and doing these postural things before we dive into exercise. Because sometimes it takes a minute just for it to sink in. Sometimes you can get a little bit sore and you have to accommodate to that and get used to it. I really don't like the idea of these boot camp clinics where you're going to do all of this in 4 hours and then the next day you're going to do it again and then you're going to do it again. I feel like it's like traffic school, just overloaded of information. You're not going to retain it. You're going to get so sore. It's too much on your body too fast. I don't agree with doing it that way. I feel like you need to incrementally learn these skills and really digest, like really get it in neurologically in your brain and in your body, get it rather than just being bombarded. So I do it in a slow, methodical way. And then the next visit we'll start to get into the exercises because now I know you, now I've seen you and figured out all the idiosyncrasies because everybody is different. We can't just say, hey, try this thing. It'll be great for you. It's not great for everybody. Everything is individual. And then we start to build out a program of Schroth exercises. And sometimes I'll throw in some Pilates or just some basic rehab tools that are also helpful, whatever that person needs. And then again, send them home with the booklet that explains everything to them so they can follow along, especially if they're traveling. They need to go home with a program that they can understand, that they can follow.
That's really impressive. I think like the way that you're in your first session, you're addressing some of your, I guess, your highest ROI, your biggest impact habits, right? Like where do people spend most of their time? In the sleeping, in the sitting, in the standing. And so addressing those immediately is so key because this is such a long game. We're looking at nano degree by nano degree improvements or preventing this in very slow ways. So it's a marathon. And to be able to change someone's life direction in a couple sessions is impressive, and I think that's what you're doing. It seems.
I feel like for me, if I do it that way and start with just the daily things, because when you give exercises to anybody, whether it's you've been to rehab or you went to a trainer or you're following something on YouTube, like the compliance is terrible. None of us follow through. What is the date that they say that most New Year's resolutions fall off? Isn't it like by
Right.
January?
Yeah.
So even if I build an amazing program for somebody with all these exercises, most likely they call me in a few months and they're like, I'm not doing it. I fell off the wagon. That's going to happen. People are just they're going to get busy. I understand that it requires like a dedicated amount of time for you to do these things for yourself, and we don't all have that. We have kids, they have businesses, whatever.
It's got to be a
But they can
priority.
yeah, but they can remember how to sit right, and they can remember how to breathe, and they can remember how to sleep with the little whatever. And that's very impactful because if you're not doing the exercises, the whole thing is lost. At least we have to have something that you can implement that will be long lasting. So I'll take what I can get when it comes to compliance.
Awesome. Yeah, compliance, I agree, is the biggest challenge. It takes us having this great health scare to realize, oh wow, I only have one life, and this could be or is seriously compromising that. And that happened in my case. I ignored it until I was 33. I was still active. I was mobile. I just was holding all these compensations. And at 33, I woke up. I was hungover, fatigued, pale. I was blocked up. Everything was choked up because it took me 8 months to figure out my psoas muscles were choking me from the inside out. My entire midsection had been bracing and compensating instead of my glutes doing the work, instead of my body, my toes activating and holding. I had these compensations which choked me from the inside out. And it took me going on the brink in these 8 months of just struggling, not feeling my life force, feeling it being choked out, to really make this a number one priority. Like it had always been a number two or three. Yeah, I do rings, I do these kind of stuff, but I didn't make it that number one priority. And that's truly when my life really got better. I think the lessons that I learned from that are amazing, but sometimes it takes that really grave scare to realize, okay, we only have one life. Let's make it a priority.
Yeah, it's unfortunate when it has to get to that point, but you have to give yourself grace, right? You're going to do the best with what you have, and you're going to do the best with the information that you have at the time. If you were a kid that was placed in a brace and not given any other information, and the brace was horrible, or you hated it, or you abandoned it, or it hurt, that's not your fault. You did the best that you could. Your parents did the best that they could. And now that you're 20, 30, 40 and you're learning, okay, let's reinvestigate this from another perspective and start where you are. Give yourself grace to start where you are and don't hang on to what happened. You can't do anything about that. That's done. Move forward from where you are now, what you have learned now, and whether it's like I reached a crisis point, I'm struggling and I'm uncomfortable and I'm not thriving, okay, then that's where you start. If it's just, oh my God, I had an x ray because of COVID, I had a lung x ray and I didn't know I had it. Okay, you start where you are. Just one foot in front of the other. It can be overwhelming. Take your time, build your team. If your team involves multiple people, then that's what it involves. It should always involve your family because you need that support to keep you sustained, to keep you motivated, to keep you supported. You need a good doctor. You need a good Schroth therapist or a physical therapist. You might need a chiropractor, an acupuncturist, a somatic like whatever your team is to help you along the way. Rely on those people to help you through the process.
Beautiful. And I think it's worth doing this 360 holistic check on yourself and enjoy the Honopono meditation, that I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you. It's a 360-degree kind of process of emotions, whether you're holding a grudge against your parents or the doctors for not doing that, and or painting yourself as this victim of this condition and giving it power because you're positioning yourself that way. This mental playground that we have can hold you back a lot of times. So making sure that we're clearing those pathways. And I think you mentioned a range of people that's worth speaking to, from the physiotherapist, the Schroth practitioner, the chiropractor, the somatic healer, whether it's going into the breath work, tropic breathing as well. And then there was one other you mentioned, which was someone else, the team. Acupuncture. Yeah. So acupuncture is, I've done a little bit. What should I say as I'm going to see an acupuncture about, hey, where, how to help them help me?
So you can come at it from any angle you want. If it's just for pain relief, which I have done and it worked very well. If it's for just calming down those crazy tight muscles that we get with scoliosis, or just to open the channels, just to free up that feeling, like you said, of just, I'm just not thriving. Like I just need to, I'm blocked. The other thing that I found was amazing for scoli is cupping, which acupuncturists and other therapists can do. Cupping is really powerful. So I love the cupping. I would try it all. And maybe the first acupuncturist isn't the best one for you. Maybe it's you have to find the right person for you. I don't know a ton about acupuncture, but I do know that it is definitely strong in the toolbox. And I do believe the research on acupuncture versus chiropractic has shown a little bit better result for scoliosis than chiropractic even did. Could be wrong,
Interesting.
but I'm
Okay.
pretty sure I saw research somewhere. The other thing I wanted to say about we were talking about the team and just your internal dialogue, right, is important, like what you're saying to yourself all day long. I'm broken. I'm disfigured. I'm distorted. I'm diseased. What like those that internal dialogue builds pathways that are not going to serve you and they could be keeping you locked in that a lot of your dis-ease. I'm not going to say disease, dis-ease. So the internal dialogue, it matters. And the good thing about social media now is that it's also an enormous platform to find support. People don't even realize how much support there is. There are Facebook groups and TikTok videos and Zoom platforms that are just people reaching out to help each other and just commiserate or to discuss or ask questions, and other doctors weigh in on these platforms. So if you're in a place where you're not getting that kind of support, there's a great way to find support in the metaverse, I guess. The Higgy Bears is one of the ones that comes to mind. She does Zoom meetings for kids and adults and parents to let them just talk it out, ask questions, and have camaraderie and understand what it's like to be in the same boat with somebody else is really powerful.
And taking your own wellness as a priority is very rewarding. It's, some people say, the greatest purpose that you could have is taking care of your wellness. And if you are looking to save the world and help other people, you can do that best when you are well. Make your wellness, yeah, make your wellness a priority. And speaking of TikTok, I'm going to ask you like maybe like a rapid fire question or like a rapid fire answer, hopefully.
Let's try.
For someone who is um, they've realized I've had this kyphosis or scoliosis. I haven't done anything about it. I was untreated, undiagnosed, but I'm starting to think that people out there are doing things and building their own postures. So, what skills do I need in my toolbox? What am I putting in my toolbox? Is it skills and a team? Is it both? What are you filling your toolbox with if you're about to get serious rebuilding your posture?
Your team. People, if you start diving into social media as a way to find your own treatment, you're going to have some problems because care for each person is so individual. You cannot follow YouTube exercises and expect to help your particular case. So I wouldn't use social media in that way. I think it's really dangerous. There's some bad information, there's incorrect information, or just people who mean well, but it's not going to work for you. So I wouldn't use it in that way until you know what's going on with you, get diagnosed, and know exactly what's happening with yourself first. But in terms of resources and outreach and camaraderie, I think it's fantastic. So I would always start with a proper diagnosis and go from there.
Beautiful. And then what skills are you putting into are you collecting in your toolbox?
As a patient,
Yes.
knowing what not to do, what things are aggravating your condition, understanding how you can make those changes, and simple tools that you can implement to make yourself feel better and support your curve and support your spine. And those are usually just the activities of daily living that could be taught to you by a practitioner. And then the tools that you would need to follow an exercise program really should be pretty simple. You don't need to have a bunch of fancy equipment. You shouldn't have to be spending thousands of dollars at boot camp weekends where they're using a lot of contraptions. I don't feel like that's sustainable for you. If you're going to go to a program that is using counterweights and levers and machines, how do you take that home? How do you keep that going in your life? It needs to be a sustainable way that you can do this at home with simple tools like just basic dowels, foam rollers, balls, Theraballs, Bosu balls, like you said, the rings, and there are so many ways that you can get good traction on your spine without having to buy a bunch of contraptions. You can put something over the doorway, you can hang at the gym, you can hang from your kitchen sink, you can use simple tools. So I wouldn't be lured into a program where they're going to be relying on a lot of contraptions. That's not going to be sustainable, in my opinion.
I agree. I agree. I see a lot of these very complex contraptions being used, and it's that to me just screams short term progress, and this is a long term game.
Long term.
Yes, it is. And
Has to
so,
be portable. We have, what if you're traveling? What if you're living in a teeny tiny apartment in New York? It has to be able to travel with you in your life. Kids go to camp. Kids are in PE class. How do they modify things like that without having all these tools at their disposal? It has to be user friendly.
yes. And as a digital nomad of sorts, I'm constantly moving different gyms. So even my equipment is changing in different times. Sometimes I don't have a gym. It's the toolbox for me is really the fundamentals of what we can do with our breath, the different types of things we can do under traction. It's really the fundamentals of understanding how we are, what capabilities our body has to allow that alignment, and then how to interact with the surrounding environment to encourage and promote that as we build our discipline and consistency, right? Because it doesn't work if we don't do the work.
I love discipline and consistency is the penultimate goal
Yeah,
with this whole thing is to be consistent and stay the course and don't beat yourself up if you fall off the wagon or if you forget. You can always refresh and you can always start again
exactly. All it takes is one breath to reset.
every day.
Andromeda, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. I think a one of the, how do I say, the most effective combination of different disciplines like being brought together, like to have the conversations that need to be had. Because see a lot of people coming from different angles, but you've got, I think, some of the most important angles that somebody needs to talk through. So I appreciate this conversation. I know it's helped a lot of people to understand that you can do something about it. It's a long term game and what it realistically takes. So how go on. Yeah, how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to continue like with the way that you approach this?
Yeah, and I would be happy to help people find resources closer to them. Sometimes they're a little bit hard to find. Schroth therapists tend to be a little bit of a unicorn in America. So I'm happy to send people to somebody closer to them. A shameless plug, I wrote a book specifically designed to answer all of these kinds of questions that people have, whether they just got diagnosed or whether their child just got diagnosed and they're like, what do I do? Tell me about how do I do these x-rays? Where do I find social media? Where do I find a Schroth therapist? What are some basic exercises? I tried to outline all of those things in this book, just like a quick and dirty, non-clinical, non-scary way. I can be reached at Scoliosis Coach. That's my business name. And I do have a TikTok and a podcast. The podcast is called Living Aligned. So you can reach me at the Scoliosis Coach, and you can email me at the Scoliosis Coach at Gmail, and I'm in Los Angeles. But I am trying to find as many Schroth therapists that I can across the country. I'm just about to go to Greece. So I'm going to meet a lot of people who are coming from Dubai and Bulgaria and Romania and Asia. So that'll be fun. And I can have a wider scope of people to send people to.
Amazing. Okay. Scoliosiscoach.com. Is that correct?
Sure,
Yeah.
that's it.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much, Andromeda.
Thank you. Be well.